Cool. Hi, welcome to this week's Digital Debate Center. So we've got a couple of announcements coming up. We have our tournament, the second tournament of October coming up soon on October 19th at Pebblebrook High School. And that's both a high school and middle school tournament. So if you are in those divisions, we hope to see you there. Second, we also have our elementary school tournament coming up on October 25th. I'm not sure if y'all in the debate center are in that division this year, but if you are, feel free to show up to that too. Today, we're going to be lecturing about how you want to go about beating the risk index affirmative when you're on the negative. So just to give you a quick reminder, the risk index affirmative is all about reducing arms sales to specifically high-risk countries. And the risk index defined high-risk countries as those that score as highest risk in a couple of different risk indices. And that includes things like being at war with another state or being heavily undemocratic. So the goal is essentially to make sure that human rights are being protected. So the advantage is called the human rights advantage. If you look at the first piece of evidence, it's from Thrall and Dormany, who are Cato researchers, and they talk about how ending arms sales is key to check future human rights violations, because when we sell weapons to regimes who violate human rights, chances are they will use those weapons to do that exact thing. And also those regimes probably depend upon that steady stream of arms in order to violate the human rights. So if the plan ends that the arms sales, then there's a good chance that we can prevent future human rights violations. Next is the Cup and More evidence, which is a pretty interesting piece of evidence that talks about how America has a unique obligation as the bastion for democracy in the West to resist human rights violations, because we are the ones who are setting the example for every other country. So if we are willing to sell arms to countries who are willing to violate human rights, then we can't say that we promote democracy in the world around us when we're actively harming that end. So that's a quick recap of the affirmative. We're going to be talking about the negative for the rest of today. So the way that this lecture is going to work is we're going to be talking about each negative speech. So the 1NC, the negative block, or the 2NC and 1NR, and then the 2NR. I'm going to be talking about potential strategies that you can use to beat the affirmative team through those speeches. So we're going to be talking both about the arguments themselves and how you should be thinking about how a debate round works when you're negative. So we're going to start with the 1NC. So the 1NC is the first negative constructive, and that's going to be the foundation for the rest of the debate round. So in your 1NC, you're laying all the groundwork that you're going to need for all the other speeches you're going to give. So the most important part of your 1NC when you're negative is your offense. In this case, it's your off-case argument, which is a manufacturing disadvantage. So we're going to go over that real quick. I'm sure that you've already practiced that a little bit, but it's important to get it fleshed out. So disadvantages have 4 parts. Uniqueness, which describes what's happening now. They have a link, which I will abbreviate as LX, which is how the plan changes what's happening now. To skip ahead a little bit, there's also an impact, which I can write IMPX, or exclamation point, which is the result of that change. In between these two things, sometimes, and in this case we do have one, you'll have what's called an internal link, which is really just the connection between those two things. So it's like the plan changes this thing, which in turn changes that, and that causes this, or the impact. So it makes it a little bit longer, but it's important to bring out the full story of the disadvantage and what's going on with it. Great. So in this case, the uniqueness argument from Reuters says that the manufacturing sector is on the brink now, but should be stable moving forward. So the card talks a little bit about how data from the manufacturing sector shows that things are doing all right, but if something drastic were to change, then it could very easily collapse. So the next piece of evidence is all about the link. So the link argument here is that when the United States reduces its sale of arms to these highest risk countries, because that would be a lot of our sales of arms, including Saudi Arabia, who is one of our biggest clients, that would have a negative impact on our manufacturing sector. So this piece of evidence is from a guy named Peter Navarro, who is an economist. He's also heavily tied to the Trump administration. So he has an active interest in pursuing this narrative because the Trump administration is actively trying to increase arms sales. But if you look at his argument, it does make some sense. His argument is that arms sales form one of the cornerstones of the American manufacturing sector, and that if all these arms producers would suddenly stop getting money from other countries, then they would probably collapse. And then that segues into the internal link. So the internal link, again, is the connection. So the loss of profits with our manufacturing sector is going to have a negative effect on American military readiness, because if our military or if our manufacturing sector isn't producing enough new goods and new developments because it doesn't have enough money to try out new things, then the American military won't be as prepared for a potential new conflict. And this cuts two ways, right? Because it's not just about, well, the United States wasn't prepared for this conflict that happened. So for an example that I can use, like we could talk about how if there were a conflict in North Korea, like a concrete conflict that happened, the US might not be prepared to respond to it. So that's a reason why military readiness is important. However, there's also the perception of military readiness versus the actual readiness of, or the actual like concrete effect of American military readiness. Because if other countries see the US as militarily unprepared, they might be more willing to go out of their way and take belligerent action. So an example of that might be if Russia sees the United States as really unprepared, they could try to take over the Baltic states because they perceive the US as weak. So it's not just a question of like conflicts that are already kind of ongoing that the US would no longer be prepared for. It's also a question of other countries seeing an opportunity if the United States is weak. And that really gets into the impact card, which talks about how military readiness is key to prevent great power war. Using that logic, the Dowd author, who's a senior fellow at the Sagamore Institute, makes the argument that peace through strength is the best way to go about things, and that only when we are militarily prepared will we actually be able to avoid conflict, because only through strength do we avoid war. Cool. So that's the most important part of your 1NC, is establishing those parts of the disadvantage, and that's called your off case or your offense. The next important part of your 1NC, which not all debaters have time to do, but is still something you should consider, is called your defense. So these are all the reasons why the negative team should win the round, but you also have a couple of defensive arguments that you can use to prove why the affirmative team isn't as big of a deal. So the two defensive arguments that we have for you are, first, on inherency. We have the Kaidanot evidence, which Kaidanot is the acting assistant secretary of state when the card was published. And Kaidanot makes the argument that new regulations like the CAT policy increase federal oversight of sales of arms, which means that there's not a problem and that no human rights will be violated in the future because the United States currently has enough oversight, which would mean that there's no point in doing the plan because the human rights violations won't happen in the future. So that's the argument you can make with inherency, is that the plan doesn't matter because the problems are already being solved in the status quo. That's how you want to frame that. The next argument you can make is the Borshevskaya evidence. And this is a piece of offense too. This is less defense than the Kaidanot evidence. So the offense that you get on the human rights advantage is that if the United States stops selling weapons to these countries, then other countries like Russia will just fill in the market share. Because the argument here is that these countries want weapons. And so even if the US isn't going to sell them weapons, they'll find someone else who will. And Borshevskaya makes the argument that if they go to other countries like Russia, even though those weapons might not be as good, they're going to be much more lethal in that these countries can then sell them to other countries after they buy the weapons. Because the US currently has regulation on arms sales that says that if you buy a weapon from us, you are not allowed to resell it to other countries. But that's not the case with Russian weapons. So that's something that you'd want to keep in mind. So when you move forward into the next negative speeches, that foundation should already be set. So the goal of the 1NC is to set the foundation to build your house, and then from that point, you can move forward into attacking the negative specific responses. But real quick, one of the most important things to think about when you are responding to, or when you are debating on the negative, is that you have two speeches in a row. So this is all about the 1NC. But the 2NC and 1NR come one right after the other. So that's something that's really important because you don't want to repeat yourself, because you have the unique opportunity in the debate round. If you're a novice, this looks like a 4-minute speech plus a 2-minute speech, which is 6 minutes. And if you remember, rebuttals are 2 minutes. So that means that the other team only has 2 minutes to respond to you. So you have a massive advantage. If you are negative, this is the point of the debate where you want to win. Because if you can set up a great foundation for your last speech, which is a 2NR, when you're giving the negative block, then you're probably going to win the round, because there's not a whole lot the affirmative can do in 2 minutes. So we're going to talk about how you want to do this. The strategy that you want to use is called splitting the block. And this is when the 2NC focuses on one thing and the 1NR focuses on another. That way you and your partner know what you're preparing for before the speech is given, and you focus on specific ideas. So we're going to go over what a good 2NC on the manufacturing DA should be. So in this case, the block split would look like manufacturing DA is your 2NC, and your 1NR is going to be case. And when I say case, I just mean that inherency argument and the Borshevskaya term. So those are the two different things that you have. Because you have the off case, which is your disadvantage, and then you have your on case, which is the responses to the affirmative's advantages. That's one way you can think of it. Cool. So the best way to give a good 2NC is to start with an overview. And we have a worksheet for you to fill out for the manufacturing DA where you can write a good overview. And what's an overview? An overview is first a quick recap of what your disad is. So it's telling the judge like, okay, well our disad is that if the plan or if the affirmative team stops selling weapons to highest risk clients, then the United States manufacturing sector will collapse because that's a cornerstone of it. That's bad. Why is it bad? That's when you're going to go into your Mr. T, which is magnitude, risk, and time frame. So you want to have in your 2NC first that brief little recap so that way the judge knows what you're talking about, and then an explanation of why your impact matters for these three reasons. So magnitude, why is it a big deal that the US could be involved in a great power war with Russia? Well, it could go nuclear, and that could cause extinction. Risk, what's the chances of it happening? Well, if the United States is not militarily prepared, even a small conflict over something like, I don't know, the South China Sea could escalate into a conflict with China because the US isn't prepared for it, so we didn't know what was going on. Time frame, how fast does it take to happen? Well, as soon as the United States or US manufacturing stops developing new technologies, then we are vulnerable and other countries will know we're vulnerable, so they can take action as soon as a few weeks from now. That's a good way that you can think about the magnitude, risk, and time frame part of your 2NC. Awesome. Cool. But that's not the only part of this debate that matters. The other important thing is that you're dealing with the arguments that they read against you. So the 2AC has a couple of arguments that they can read against this disadvantage. They have a Thrall and Dormany piece of evidence that talks about how the 1AC outweighs because human rights are more important than economic concerns. So human rights outweigh econ. The argument here is that even though things like the economy matter, at the end of the day, if human rights aren't your first priority, then it doesn't matter if our economy is doing well. One way you could respond to this is that actually, in this case, economic concerns do matter more because if the United States isn't militarily prepared and we let our manufacturing sector decline, then no one's going to be around to have human rights because we're involved in a great power war and everything collapses. So that's one way you could respond to that. And the next argument they have is they have the Hartung and Arabia evidence, which talks about how there is no link because arms sales aren't, or that's still equal, key to manufacturing or the US economy. So the way you want to respond to that is to bring back your Navarro evidence, and you have another piece of Navarro evidence to read here where you want to explain the exact amount that arms sales contribute to the United States manufacturing sector. Another thing that you can say is that it's a spillover effect. If a couple of companies involved with arms sales stop producing arms, then all the companies they work with aren't getting paid for the work that they're no longer doing either. And so it's a spillover effect, and that all these companies are tied together and they're all losing money. And even though they only cut arms sales out, these other companies don't have as much money coming in to try out new things or to produce new techniques because they aren't willing to take as many risks as well. So that's a good answer to that no link argument, and that builds on the arguments that are present in your evidence. Awesome. And so there's a couple of things that I did want to rehash with what a good overview could look like. One thing you can talk about is called turning the case, which is when you're explaining how your impact actually accesses all of their offense. So that gets to what I wanted to talk about this later because that's kind of the answer that we gave to this human rights argument where you're like, actually, if we all die in a great power war, there are no human rights for us to have. That's a kind of case turn argument because you're saying that you access the other team's offense because if your impact happens, then so does theirs. So that means that there's no reason to prove the affirmative team because in the world of the negative, both the negative impact and the affirmative impact, which are human rights violations, still happen. Cool. So that's what you want to do with your 2 and C. You want to make sure that you are explaining your impact. That's your first goal, to explain your offense. And you want to make sure that you're answering the negative or the affirmative team's defense to your offense. Those are the 2 goals of 2 and C. Next, we're going to talk about the 1 and R. So in this structure, the 1 and R's job would be mostly to be reading the defense against the case. In this case, there's some offense on the case as well, but the general point is that you're responding to the affirmative's case. So we already talked about the inherency argument from the last go around. And the inherency argument was just that the affirmative doesn't matter. It's a drop in the bucket because the CAT policy means that we're actually going to solve human rights violations now. So you would want to extend that piece of evidence and then give some explanation as to why it's true. If the other team doesn't answer that card, then you can say, Judge, they have conceded the Kaidnaw piece of evidence, which means that they don't have any inherency in this round. That means you have to vote negative because if they are not inherent, then there's no problem for them to solve. They've conceded that the CAT policy is going to solve human rights violations of the status quo. You can't do the affirmative plan. The only thing that would happen with the affirmative plan is the disadvantage because they can't solve their own impacts because their impacts are already being solved. So that's one way you can present that story with the no inherency evidence. You can also use the Borshevskaya piece of evidence as an offensive claim here. And that's pretty strategic because if you are correct that if the plan passes, other countries will just fill in for the United States and they'll sell weapons to all of these countries, then again, there's no point of doing the plan because the plan doesn't actually solve its own impacts. In fact, it causes them. Because if the United States stops selling weapons, then other countries are just going to sell weapons, and the human rights violations that they're claiming to solve for just continue on and on and on ad infinitum. So that's the 1 R. I really want to emphasize to you that this is where you win the debate round, is in the block when you're negative. Because you want to make sure that you are, first of all, overwhelming the other team with arguments. Because if you have more than what they can respond to, chances are they're going to drop something. And you want to make sure that you're answering all the things that they present. Because if you do both of those things, then they have to pick and choose 1 or 2 specific points that they made in their 2AC to emphasize in their 1AR. And when they're limited to doing that, you have all of the advantages because you said 6 minutes worth of stuff and they can only say 2 minutes worth of stuff. So chances are, as long as you know what you're doing in your 2 and R, you're going to win the round. So what's a good 2 and R look like? A good 2 and R is essentially a condensed version of a block. So you want to make sure that you have your offense, which is what your 2 and C was. And if you have time, you want to make sure you get in a little bit of defense too. So that's what you want to think about. And when you're giving a 2 and R, one of the most important things is you also want to pick and choose. So if the affirmative team did a really good job responding to your magnitude claim and your time frame claim, but they said nothing about your risk, what you can do here is you can talk about, well, we still have a high magnitude and a high time frame, and you can talk about that for like maybe 3 or 4 seconds. But the biggest part of our offense is risk. They've conceded that, and blah, blah, blah. You explain your risk part of the your overview, and you would blow that up on your offense. Because what you want to do is you want to capitalize on the parts of your 2 and C that they were weakest on. And then you want to make that a big deal. And you want to make sure that you're explaining that to the judge too. You want to make sure you explain to the judge why it matters if they didn't respond to an argument in a previous speech. How would you do that? You would say, A, they've conceded this, which means that they agree that it's true. And B, they don't get another chance to respond to it later on. They had their 1 hour to respond to this. We don't get another speech after this to answer their new arguments, so you can't give them any new arguments now. So those are the 2 things you want to say. You want to say that first, it's true. Second, they don't get a chance to respond. So your offense is emphasizing your overview, which is explaining first the story of your disadvantage, and second, why your disadvantage matters. And that's your Mr. T. After you've done that, you want to answer whatever defense they presented. So if they had enough time to extend their no link argument, you would want to then talk about what you said in your 2NC about the link briefly, and you want to cover why that argument doesn't matter. And once you've done that, you should be good to go into defense. Because again, you have 2 minutes. So this speech is high pressure because you don't have that much time. But the goal of it is to make sure that you're picking and choosing the best things that you've presented earlier in the round so that you don't have to do all the work in your 2NR. Rather, you're building on work that you did in your 1NC and your 2NC. So then your defense, maybe you extend the Borshevskaya turn. Maybe you extend the cat policy inherency argument. You can pick and choose which one. I would personally pick which one the affirmative talked about the least because that puts them in the most compromising position because they don't know how the judge is going to evaluate the argument they just made. So that's how you want to talk about beating the risk index affirmative on the negative. And one strategy tip I might give to you real quick, though, at the end, is that I personally think you should emphasize magnitude. Because the way that this debate round is probably going to play out when you're talking about human rights versus great power war, the other team is probably going to win if there's a high risk and a fast time frame for human rights violations. Because we can see that they're happening now, and that means that they're already ongoing. So there's a high risk and a high time frame for that. Your job is to prove why your magnitude is higher. So why is it a big deal that the United States is getting involved in a great power war? That's how you're probably going to win this round, is by explaining your magnitude. And you can definitely explain why that matters more than risk or time frame. You can say, sure, there are all these short-term concerns that are highly likely, but even the slightest chance that we all go extinct makes that moot. Because then there's a chance that none of us are there or none of us would be able to experience human rights anymore because we're all dead. That's the way that you could respond to that argument. Awesome. I hope this has been helpful. That's how you want to think about a negative round when you're debating against the risk index affirmative. And honestly, this is how you want to think about negative rounds whenever you're negative. You want to think about your 1NC as your foundation. You want to think about your 2NC and 1NR as the part in which you'll win the round, because this is when everything that you want to say in the round comes out. This is when you're picking and choosing your most important strategy. And you're setting up for your 2NR, which is really just like the last thing. And it's you're talking about the offense that you already established in your 2NC and 1NR, and you're just rehashing the main points that the affirmative did not talk about as well as they could have. Awesome. Thank you so much. And we're on to the Q&A portion. Hi, and just to let you know, we are planning to, if there are no questions, we would be planning to shut down the debate center in around 5 minutes or so. Hi, thanks for those of y'all who joined us for today's lecture. We'll be shutting down the debate center shortly. If there are no questions, please try to get them in the next minute or so. But again, thank you all for coming.